Sup you sinister folks, welcome to the part 1, of What If Deku's Cursed Blood, Could You Know Reverse Death, Chapter 1, Sinister Origin. Author's note: here is something I've been cooking for some time, and that I wanted to publish. Updates may come slowly, but I hope that no more accidents happen to keep me away from writing. I have to warn you though, this may be a little too gruesome for some. Izuku Midoriya was a 4-year-old who already knew what he wanted to be when he grew up, what to aim for in his life. He wanted to be a hero, someone who could save anyone in need with a smile on his face. This was why he couldn't wait for these tests to finish, for the doctor to finally come and announce what his amazing quirk was. Izuku Midoriya watched her bouncing baby boy with a warm smile on her face, knowing better than to even attempt to bring his excitement down with reality. She knew that with her quirk being so weak, and her husband's being only mildly useful, Izuku's chances at developing anything powerful were rather low. But as they say, hope is the last to die. Well, the results are ready. The elderly doctor, clad in round glasses and a protruding belly, announced as he entered the room, gaining the attention of the duo. "Is it something amazing?" Izuku asked quickly. "I hope it's something amazing." The smile stretched across his little face showed no sign of fading, even in the face of the doctor's rather serious gaze. Izuku watched with growing dread as the doctor rubbed the bridge of his nose before dropping heavily into a chair, surely a clear sign of the man working to find the words to describe a terrible prognosis. The mother worried at what those words could possibly be. The horrible word, quirkless, flashed before her mind's eye. "Well, it's unusual, but nothing too amazing. We've discovered that your blood produces and houses special microorganisms. These microorganisms appear to retain the basic genetic information of their host, you, and whenever an anomaly of any kind is detected, say for instance structural damage such as broken tissue or bones or internal irregularities like bacterial or viral infections, they immediately go about repairing or erasing that anomaly." The doctor explained all of this while flipping through the papers he'd carried in with him. Peering over the edge of his papers and glasses, he noticed the confused stares of the mother and son before him. "In layman's terms, you appear to have a rarely seen type of regeneration quirk. But it doesn't seem to be extreme in any way." Izuku, taking in the information she could understand, suddenly snapped her fingers. "Well, that explains why he's never been sick," the mother announced, reminiscing on how healthy her son had been up to now, not even suffering a single bout of colic as a newborn. "But it's good, right? I can be a hero that..." Izuku began to speak, his voice denoting both obvious disappointment at not getting to be as strong as his idol, and resolute strength in embracing the idea of becoming a less extreme hero. The doctor's cold glare silenced him. "You'd better give up on that dream, kid. You may be able to heal 10 times faster than the average person, but this isn't a quirk that's going to stop a bullet or make you stronger. You'd be better at something like hospital work, or handling biological material in experiments." The doctor's words were delivered flatly, without regard to the boy's feelings, as if he wanted to crush his dreams. "Doctor, isn't that a little extreme? I mean, maybe these micro-thingies are capable of more, or will be as he grows up." Izuku threw out her thoughts on the matter, trying to cheer up her son. Her words earned a small smile from the now teary-eyed little boy. "I know what you're trying to do, but please, this isn't an emitter quirk," the doctor said, turning to the woman. "Your son's quirk acts like a mutant type. And in most cases with mutants, we know improving is next to impossible. It doesn't help that these microorganisms die, without fail, less than 30 minutes after leaving their host's body. Chances for development, let alone research, seems to be impossible." Standing, the doctor handed over some paperwork for Izuku to complete. Izuku began to feel like a failure. All of his dreams of saving people with a smile were quickly going up in smoke, leaving his future unclear, uncertain. Later that night, Izuku woke from her fitful slumber to a sudden noise, one that she'd heard many times before. The sound of that particular video that her son loved to watch tickled at the edges of her hearing. Still half asleep, the mother reached the door to her son's room, dreading having to take a look inside, dreading what she feared she'd find. "Izuku?" Inko called as she slowly pushed the door open. Framed by a single glowing computer screen in a room full of darkness sat her son. Slowly, he turned to her, his face full of fearful tears. Mom, can I be a hero? Like All Might?" Izuku asked with a trembling voice, trying to grasp at anything that resembled hope. Hope for his dream. Inko quickly grabbed him up in a hug, trying to pour every last drop of love she had into him. She hugged him through all of her own tears, feelings of hopelessness, and the heart-shattering realization that she had failed her son. "Yes. Of course you can. Even if not like All Might. You can be a hero," Inko replied with what little strength she could muster. The acrid taste of lying to her son sat heavily on her tongue. 10 years later. "This is pointless," Izuku muttered as he sat on the doorstep of an abandoned cabin in the middle of the woods. Izuku had been left there during the school's camping trip, an annual tradition, as a test of valor, part of the trip itself. But over the years he'd become used to taking the role of punching bag of his fellow classmates. And that applied doubly so for his once best friend, Katsuki Bakugo. Once the blonde's quirk of secreting self-detonating nitroglycerin-like sweat had become public, and was compared against his own, Bakugo had made it his personal mission to make his life hell. A total waste of time. Izuku continued his muttering, taking the time to indulge in his depressing pastime. Reminiscing on his life. He almost wished he'd been born quirkless sometimes. Maybe then he'd at least have been shown some pity. Or stopped clinging so tightly to the dream of being a hero. Or at the very least Bakugo would have been less aggressive in his bullying. He still remembered when, at 7 years old, he'd attempted to help his longtime friend after he'd fallen in a shallow river and in thanks had been pushed away headfirst onto an outcropping of sharp rocks nearby. The severe wounds had closed and healed in under a minute before everyone's eyes, revealing a yet undiscovered attribute of his quirk. On that day, Bakugo had found the perfect punching bag, one too hard to kill, but too useless for anyone to care about. Completely useless, he'd said. PFT. Izuku almost spat in self-pity. Instead, he decided to summon a happier memory, one where he'd felt useful, almost like a hero. He'd been 12 when he'd faced his first instance of real, life-and-death violence meant to kill. He'd been hiding from his habitual tormentor during a late evening walk home when he'd heard it. The scream. A girl's scream. Before he'd even had time to think, he darted into the nearby dark alley and tackled the first body he encountered. The man had turned out to be twice his size in height and weight, his charge only successful in throwing the thug off balance due to its suddenness. The girl had taken the chance to run, never looking back. For his trouble, he'd been stabbed 7 times. The wounds were gone before he picked himself up off the ground, not that it had helped calm his frantic mother. "It doesn't matter if anyone knows," Izuku said to himself with a tiny smile, "as long as that girl ended up okay." Around him, he noticed the sun was setting and the cold was beginning to creep in. Any camper caught unaware would surely end up with frostbite. Not that Izuku, the regenerator, had anything to worry about. Regenerator, the name he'd given his quirk. The moniker defined the fact that he'd heal back from any wound or sickness at abnormal speed. He just wished he'd been able to test it against something worse than the average cold or the cuts and scrapes of bullying. Unfortunately, being labeled as a mutant type had led to none being willing to test his limits, or go beyond them. And don't even get him started on his mother. If they had, maybe he'd know why the little friends in his blood died soon after leaving his body. Or maybe he'd know why his healing factor so greatly exceeded the doctor's original projections. His stabbing had shown him that his wounds closed almost instantly, with little bleeding. But here he was, largely in the dark about himself. I wish you guys could do more outside my body. Maybe then I could be a healing hero, like Recovery Girl," Izuku said toward his arm, a habit formed from too many lonely school days. Others had laughed and picked on him even more for it, but it was something he never stopped doing. Probably because he could feel his very veins tickle every time he talked to them. It was almost like they'd talk back. In the distance, the waning moon ascended, bringing its pitiful light to shroud the world in an ominous luminescence. Having long since become accustomed to surviving on his own in situations such as this, Izuku quickly made a campfire with ease. Really, he only bothered with it to keep the wildlife away. It wasn't like he'd freeze to death. His blood never allowed his internal temperature to drop at all, a fortunate side effect that unfortunately didn't cross over too well into heat resistance. He just wished he wouldn't have to suffer the intense hunger pangs whenever he'd have to heal up too much. I bet everyone is having a good time with their marshmallows and hot cocoa. Izuku descended into his dark mutterings once again, remembering that he was the only one repeatedly tested with spending nights alone in the woods. The other kids just had to walk along a small path in the middle of the night, one very close to the main camp, and got to keep their electricity and other commodities, whatever. It's not like I really wanted to spend time with them. Happy birthday. To me, Izuku finished his muttering with a somber expression on his face. He couldn't refrain from thinking on how this night was similar to so many others. Spent all alone. I wish I'd thought to bring my notebooks, Izuku groused. At least then his unhappiness would have just been nominal, but without his working material he felt his moroseness only increased. He loved thinking on ways to make use of his quirk to be a hero. Even though it had been incredibly difficult to come up with any ideas beyond serving as a meat shield. The night continued its course, unconcerned about the young boy and his depression, unconcerned about the hell about to break loose. Suddenly, the soft roar of a distant truck engine filtered through the regular nightscape white noise. Accelerating at an uneven pace, as if either chasing or fleeing something, the roaring sharply rose in volume. Izuku's mind was quick to formulate two theories on this abrupt development. Either it was a case of villains attempting to escape local authorities and something he was better off staying away from, or worse, an innocent was on the run from villains. It was the second possibility that had him moving toward the largely unused road ahead. What if, by chance, someone really was in danger? What if he could help that person? Help! A sudden, terrified scream had Izuku running forward without thinking. That it had been the voice of a girl, one that seemed to be in pain and scared, was undeniable. Over here! Izuku shouted into the night, hoping to guide the girl to safety. Soon, the shaking and shuffling of foliage announced the arrival of the owner of the voice. "Oh God!" Izuku whispered as he saw a form step from the shadows. The small lantern he'd hidden away from the other students, with the help of a meager moonlight, managed to illuminate the girl. He could easily make out tattered rags and a terrified facial expression. Then the truck burst onto the scene, along with the glint of the gun being wielded by the driver. "Watch out!" Izuku shouted as he tackled the girl to the side, just as the gun was fired. Searing pain exploded along his back as 5 bullets struck him, causing him to roll multiple times before coming to a stop. Now lying on his side, Izuku could do nothing but look at the girl as she stared back at him with sorrowful eyes, her mouth filling with blood as her lips traced the words of a muted apology. He never heard the truck as it stopped, nor the figure of the driver as it stood over him. He did hear the first of 2 gunshots, however. Kids these days, always wanting to play hero without considering the consequences, the figure said, voice high enough to register as feminine. A practiced motion followed, and the gun was effortlessly reloaded. "Just remember, this is all your fault. He died because you ran away from the job I so kindly gave you. You wanted out? Well, here's your out." The figure stared the bleeding girl in the eye, unblinking, and emptied the entire new clip into her. As the last echoes of the execution faded, the night fell into uneasy silence, broken only by the fading roar of the retreating truck. Izuku waited until he could no longer hear anything save for the tentative cries of the Higurashi to move, quickly sitting up. Tensing his aching back, he let out gasping breaths as his body spit out the numerous bullets that had burrowed into him. Standing, he rushed to the girl, unconcerned with whether or not his wounds had closed properly. His only objective was the girl. There had to be something he could do to save her. Come on. Don't die. Please don't die. You're too pretty to die. Izuku nearly shouted at the girl as he wrapped his arms under hers and dragged her into the abandoned cabin. Once he reached the wooden structure, he noticed that miraculously his phone was not only intact, but mostly charged and retaining good reception. Please, stay with me, just a little longer. Please. Izuku pressed his left hand against the girl's wounds, a seemingly futile attempt to prevent her death, while he used his right to dial the police's emergency number. The concepts of travel time and terrain restrictions never crossed his panicked mind. Hello? The quick response of the operator gave the green-haired boy hope, his belief in the girl's survival bolstered. Please SS send help, she's bleed. Izuku, his fear eating him from the inside out, was unable to control his stammering. This line is for real emergencies, kid, not childish nightmares, the operator tiredly grumbled. Why don't you just go back to sleep? There was a clicking sound, and the line was cut. He'd been ignored. No. No, no, no. No. Izuku began to slip further into his panic, dialing the next number he could think of for more immediate help. Hey. Midoriya-chan. Do you really want to lose the hick challenge? Izuku hung up as soon as he realized the slurred voice that had answered was that of his teacher. Out of options, he thought of the only person who'd never say no to the idea of helping him. Mom? Please, help. Izuku whispered through the phone as soon as his call had been picked up. All thoughts of being bullied for running to mommy had long since been thrown out, replaced by the single-minded desire to save the life of the girl dying in front of him. Suddenly, the girl began to heave, her skin ghostly pale and chilled. Izuku knew these symptoms from health class. The girl was going into shock. He also knew that if she wasn't stabilized soon, death was assured. Acting instinctively, he dropped his phone and searched the cabin for anything that would help. Besides a useless cot, there was only a pocket knife. Izuku looked at the girl. The knife. The girl. His wrist. If there's even the smallest chance you guys can help. This is it, Izuku said with apprehension. Quickly, before the tickles could begin, he raised the knife to his skin and cut his wrist. Come on. Please. Heal her. Izuku begged through freely falling tears. Fighting through the stinging pain shooting up from his wrist, he directed the gushing appendage to spill its treasure over any open wounds he could see. After a minute, and a generous dosage of blood, he moved his hemorrhaging wrist to the girl's mouth. To his surprise, the lips turned away, the girl gritting her teeth to speak through her tremors. Don't do that. I'm filthy. Her final breath taken, the girl collapsed, a puppet with its strings cut. Izuku's panic reached maximum and, mindlessly, he jumped into giving the girl CPR. 20 minutes passed before the raving screams from his mother coming from his forgotten phone pulled him back to reality. Gently, he picked the device up, addressing his mother through her cries. Mom. I need you. The sheer haunted quality of her son's voice cut Enko off mid-ramble. Izuku swallowed thickly. I couldn't save her. I couldn't be a hero. Lost in his own shock, Izuku stared listlessly at his greatest failure. He was unbothered by the knowledge that the rags that adorned the girl hardly covered her private parts, that she was obviously not wearing underwear, that scars and bruises covered more of her skin than not. Only one thing repeated in his mind, over and over again. He was a useless kid after all. Just a failure. Dawn. The police cars and ambulance arrived in front of the abandoned cabin just as the sun began to rise over the horizon. From one of the cars burst one Inko Midoriya, utterly drowning in her overly active imagination's fears regarding her son. Her eyes scanned the area, searching for her baby boy. Soon enough she found him, sitting on the cabin's porch, by the closed front door. Izuku! Inko screamed in anguish as she reached her distraught son, who looked as if he hadn't stopped crying until he physically couldn't produce any more tears. "Mom. I think I'm cursed," were the only words Izuku uttered as he was engulfed within the fierce embrace of his mother. This only served to increase the poor woman's distress. "Don't say that. You did everything you could, more even." No hero could say the same here. Inko nearly shouted as she gave her baby kisses on his head. She knew, call it maternal instinct, that her son was going through his life's most dire moment to date. He'd given his all to save someone, be a hero like he'd always wanted, and failed. "It's okay, kid, we'll take it from here," announced the cop, a young woman with close-cropped hair, that had driven the car Inko had arrived in. The uniformed woman reached for the door of the cabin, but froze when the boy she and her co-workers had been sent to find seized her wrist. She made a mental note that the boy's grip was much too strong for one his age. "Miss Officer, do you have a gun?" It wasn't so much the question that scared both the cop and Inko, but the disturbed look that gazed out from Izuku's eyes. "Izuku?" Inko hesitantly took a step towards her son. I'm sorry. I swear I didn't mean to." Izuku suddenly cried in distress, incredible guilt weighing his words. "All right, kid. Why don't you take a breath and calmly explain what you did," the cop suggested sweetly, before adding, "and why I need my gun to go into the cabin." Fully expecting the little boy to confess to staring at the naked body of the victim, or perhaps even to touching it as his puberty-driven hormones came into play, she was not prepared for the reality of the answer. My, quirk, I heal abnormally fast, it's my blood you see? I tried to use it. On her." Bashfully, Izuku lifted his muddied shirt, revealing fading scars that the cop immediately recognized as bullet wounds. Months-old bullet wounds by all appearances. Inko nearly fainted on the spot, her worst fears confirmed. Someone had tried to kill her baby, shot him multiple times over in fact, and if it weren't for his regeneration, they'd have succeeded. And even with his quirk, she knew he'd felt every agonizing second of his injuries. "So, is she dead, or not?" the uniformed woman asked, apprehensive now. Police academy and in-service training scenarios relating to uncontrolled quirks flashed through her mind. She really hoped they weren't going to have to deal with an angry and disoriented villain now. "No. I mean, yes. I mean, you may need to use your gun." Discomforted by the child's nonsensical answer, the policewoman readied her gun while Inko, still wrapping her son in her arms, stepped the two away from the cabin's door. "Just in case." "Okay. You two, stay here while I check things inside," the policewoman said as she steeled herself. She could do this. She's seen just how wild and unpredictable, uncontrolled quirks could get. This wasn't going to be anything she couldn't handle. Gun first, the policewoman slowly entered the cabin. Instantly, her mind set about cataloging the large pool of blood in the center of the room, the metal lumps that had to be used bullets, there were a lot of them, and the bloody footprints that led to a corner of the room where the victim stood. The victim stood. Jerking back, the policewoman frantically swung her gun up and around. The victim was eerily pale, cause unknown, though her hair was new moon midnight black and fell straight down to her waist. It was obvious that it was a her, as the bits of cloth that could be considered clothes did next to nothing to provide modesty as the girl stood there in all of her 6 feet. Oh God, she was standing. "Young lady, are you okay? Do you need medical attention? Help of any kind?" The policewoman asked the standardized questions as she took small steps forward, gun slightly lowered. The girl, whose head had been bowed, straightened and faced forward. Now the policewoman could see that it wasn't clothes she was wearing, but the remains of a sackcloth dress cut to serve as impromptu clothing. She knew from records that this was often seen with girls who'd been sold as sex slaves, the now visible scars crisscrossing the girl's body leading credence to this line of thinking. "Hugh," the girl groaned, her lifeless red eyes staring through the policewoman. Unsure if she'd been understood, the uniformed woman tried again. "Ieto, why don't you come over here?" the policewoman asked. "We can get you checked out." At the edges of her mind, an unsettling word, a thought, began to take root. She really wanted to ignore its possibility. Ah! Another groan. The girl took a step forward, but in every way the movement appeared unnatural. It was more jerkish than a limp, but smoother than a wholly robotic movement. It was as if something else moved the girl's body. "You know what? No. All right? Better just stay there. I'll call the experts." The policewoman finally succumbed to her fear. She wasn't dealing with a sick or injured person. This was an honest-to-God reanimated corpse. "Mah!" The slightly louder moan, accompanied by the corpse beginning to sway in motion, was all it took for the policewoman to panic and, without warning, shoot her entire clip, dead center into the chest of the thing before her. The girl barely reacted. Eh? There were no words for the emotions running through the policewoman as she watched the girl peer down at her bullet-riddled chest for a brief moment before turning an empty red-eyed glare her way. When the growling started, she dropped her gun, turned, and fled, hoping to move faster than the girl fitfully, striding after her. "Nah-oo-oo!" The policewoman screamed as she burst from the cabin, tripping as she reached the gravel outside. Inko watched in utter horror as the officer landed almost in front of her just as a pale, dark-haired girl nearly flew out of the cabin after her. The young girl looked to be in a feral rage and the green-haired woman immediately moved to shield her son from the coming violence. "When stop!" Izuku shouted. The girl immediately froze, all momentum suddenly gone, as she stood, back straight, seeming to be awaiting further command. Did you just... The policewoman broke herself off, half expecting this to be a dream, half expecting it to be a nightmarish reality. "Izuku, you did this?" Inko ventured to ask, doing her best to convey love and understanding in the face of the situation. "I'm sorry, Mom. I think my quirk makes zombies," Izuku said, guilt darkening his face, regret deadening his voice. "It's okay, baby. You didn't know this would happen. You didn't do it on purpose. I'm sure this won't cause you any problems. Isn't that right, officer?" Inko assured as she looked to the policewoman with pleading eyes. "Of course you're in big trouble. Young man, what you did was..." A growl was all it took to cause the policewoman's words to die in her throat. The rumbling was deeper this time, almost as if denoting hatred. "Why did I have to have such a horrible quirk? I must be cursed!" Izuku cried. He didn't want this. This would only bring him more problems. "I'm sorry, Izuku. It's my fault, not yours," Inko cried too, holding herself responsible for this disaster. She's the one who couldn't even give her son a better quirk. Running back to her car, the policewoman called for immediate backup. The single other officer that had gone to clear the area wasn't going to be enough to deal with this. As it was, she couldn't bear to take her eyes off the zombie. It had to be dangerous. It had to be. Every movie ever pointed to the creatures being infectious and rabid. Calling on every quirk report she'd ever had to schlep through as a rookie, her memory recalled the fact that there were other zombie maker quirks out there, so someone had to know what to do now. Hours later, local police station. Izuku and Inko sat in the small, rather plain office, patiently waiting for the station chief to direct them as to the procedures they were to follow now. Besides knowing they needed to deal with the new development of the younger's quirk, the only reassurances the two had received had been that there would be no charges or fines for what had happened. "Are you all right? Does it hurt?" Inko asked to her baby boy once again, intently searching over his torso and the holes in his shirt. Izuku lifted the piece of cloth to show his naked chest and back in an obvious show of obedience and understanding. "Not anymore, Mom." Izuku patted his front, now showing unblemished skin and no signs of ever having been hurt in the first place. "But this is good, right?" Izuku said, "Now we know bullets can't kill me." Too bad my body didn't shield her though. Covering himself again, the green-haired boy directed his eyes to the mistake he'd made. The undead girl stood by his side, lifeless eyes lost to a distant horizon. The presently vacant expression she sported denoted lack of any active intelligence or will. This had made the trek from the cabin additionally nightmarish. Unwilling to have the girl sit next to her in her vehicle, the policewoman's reticence had Izuku suffering being squished in the back of the cruiser with a corpse while Inko was left to constantly fret over her son's position in the front. While Inko's situation was unfortunate, the adults had found that Izuku's presence was the only thing keeping the monster calm and quiet. Reaching the station hadn't improved matters by much. Both Izuku and the zombie girl were immediately subjected to a barrage of medical tests, only the green-haired boy's command, forcing the undead girl to comply. Unfortunately, having his blood drawn for samples proved to be too much for the accidental monster, who'd become enraged at the sight. Izuku managed to calm the girl after repeated commands, and no one was hurt, but all present remained spooked afterwards. Izuku, the human body isn't meant to stop bullets. Don't you dare jump in the way like that again. What would have happened if you had been shot in the head? Inko admonished her son, her worry made evident that she just wanted him to be safe. He'd probably survive. The station chief followed his statement into the room, scrunching his nose at the fetid odor that filled his office. Holding on to his professionalism, he refrained from commenting on it. The two Madraya stood, bowing to the man. He appeared well above his 40s, and sported a receding hairline, but overly large arms that strained the seams of his shirt. "Excuse me?" Inko, obviously horrified at the prospect of her baby son being shot in the head. "Or anywhere to start with," gasped. "I would?" Izuku asked with a frown, not knowing if that was good or not, or why the chief though such was possible. "You survived gunshots to the heart, lungs, and the liver. At the same time. I've seen many a regeneration quirk during my career, but yours is the most prolific by far," the chief explained as he took his seat, shuffling the files on his hands. "Are you sure it's a mutant type?" "Well, that's what the doctor said. And it's not like he consciously goes about ordering his blood to heal him, it just happens," Inko explained, for his son, who limited himself to nodding. He didn't want to start stuttering now. "I see. Anyway, let's start by addressing the less than deceased here. We were able to find a match in our database. This here is Yamada." The chief began to read a file, taking glances between the zombie and the picture in the profile. "Oh, that's great. Izuku, at the very least we can return her to." "No, I'm sorry," says here she was disowned by her parents for running away with her boyfriend, who was also her idol manager in the making. "Well, that's what it says here anyway," the chief interrupted. He coughed in the face of what followed in the file. She was registered to missing persons by her friends when they couldn't contact her after an entire month of trying. Unfortunately, this scenario fits the MO a certain ring of traffickers uses to pull in victims for trafficking. Poor girl. But why? Inko was quick to pity the zombie girl, who appeared unaware that the conversation was about her. "Well, she's quirkless for one, and came from a troubled family," the chief continued. "I know it sounds cruel, but some people tend to use their quirkless members as bargain chips, offering up girls like Tay as brides in exchange for social status, or as a way to ensure they can marry at all. Nowadays, it's not as if many, heroes included, desire normal companionship." Both mother and son gasped at the truth of their society, though Inko was less surprised than she let on. Now, continuing with the report. Ms. Yamada presents numerous scars corresponding to physical abuse. Signs of forced abortions. At least 6 STDs came up as positive, with a few of her internal organs showing the typical degradation caused by such. In fact, the fetid odor I'm sure you noticed is more than likely a result of this degradation. The chief would have continued his explanation, but paused at the horrified look Inko shot her son's way. "And no, your son is perfectly clean, even when he had such close contact with her. We were only able to test for STDs though, as his blood short lifespan doesn't seem to have changed since the original tests. Izuku hadn't even considered disease transfer during the haze of his panic. Hearing that he was in the clear now caused him no small relief. Relief shared by Inko in no small measure. Now, to address your situation, Mr. Midoriya, the chief regained their attention, making mother and son go stiff in response to seriousness of his voice. Yes sir. Izuku cursed his typical stutter, though it softened the face of the chief. Son, I'm afraid to be the one to tell you this, but you're now the owner of a reanimated corpse, the chief declared, sounding for all the world as if he just passed a life sentence. Maybe he had. What? Mother and son exclaimed at the same time, neither of them even considering they'd be keeping the zombie. There is no third party we can contact to reclaim the body, the chief began his explanation. In addition, she no longer has legal documentation proving her identity. More importantly, according to the quirk clause regarding the quirk registry, your powers must be studied in every aspect presented. This means we need to know how long you can keep her moving and when she stops for good. Upon such occurring, you will be required to report to the registry for further instructions and perhaps even surrender the body for further study by the local authority. Is this legal? For me to keep her? Izuku asked, avoiding with all his might suggesting that he'd own the girl beside him. That is how it's worded, and that's what the higher-up said over the phone, the chief assured before fixing Izuku with a stern look. That being said, necrophilia is still illegal. Midoriya residence. Hours later, Izuku, Inko, and their new friend arrived home emotionally drained and intensely hungry. The camping trip had been all but forgotten, overridden by the pressing need to feel clean after everything they'd just been through. With matching heavy sighs and a groan from their newest member, they stumbled through their front door. Mom, do you think I can be a hero? Izuku asked while looking at the zombie girl with apologetic eyes. Inko's heart ached at his plea and the obviously dark thoughts crossing his mind. Yes, my baby boy, you can. Maybe she can do the heavy lifting, and you can focus on using your wonderful mind. Inko replied, liking the idea of her son staying away from danger, even if that meant using a poor corpse as a meat shield. Yeah. Maybe. Izuku wasn't convinced, but decided to drop the subject, favoring the idea of taking a long bath to think things over. He decided he'd go to bed early. He needed time to make plans regarding how to approach his quirk, and how he was going to deal with school. Well now, come help me to give this girl a bath. She needs a good cleaning, Inko said, a sudden idea for helping her son gain a little confidence after his ordeal popping into her head. It would also reduce the fetid odor that had followed their newest member home. Hopefully. What? Izuku nearly had a heart attack at the order he'd been given. Or maybe he had. He probably wouldn't even notice. That day, Izuku learned more about women than he'd ever had in sex ed class. Chapter 2, Sinister Resolve. Magnus, I'm enjoying writing this, and I sure hope you enjoy reading it. The build-up is going to be slow, but the payoff will be worth it, at least to my taste, so, enjoy. 6 months had passed since the incident in the forest, and it had been 6 months of problems for the boy with cursed blood. While the first week after had been given to him by the school to take time to heal, mostly his mind due to his healing factor, Inko hadn't easily accepted such a short reprieve. She'd argued that Izuku had suffered a major trauma and needed more time, but the principal had insisted, pointing to the boy's lack of need for medical attention, and he'd been forced to return before either Midoriya felt ready. This is a waste of time, Izuku whispered as he finished his test less than 15 minutes after it had begun. He knew beyond a doubt he'd aced it, so he'd just spend the time thinking. As embarrassing as it had been, Izuku almost would have preferred it if he could go back to that first week. It had been an enlightening period after all. Not only had he learned way too much about female anatomy, he'd also received a crash course in the etiquette involved with dealing with the opposite sex. While Tay had obviously been completely cooperative, his mother had insisted that he learn everything possible about her and how to treat her. That, as it turned out, included how to dress her and make her presentable. "Let's hope Mom makes lots for dinner tonight," Izuku whispered over to Tai, who stood by his side dressed in her now customary green tracksuit. The garb easily succeeded in concealing her curves, but more importantly it hid any signs of her being undead. "What do you think?" After that rather informative week, he'd finally returned to school. And pandemonium. The principal had forgotten to inform the teachers about his extra baggage that he would be bringing with him, that he had a right to keep bringing with him. Rumors had immediately spread like wildfire. Izuku had hired an actress to simulate an upgrade of his quirk. He'd sold batches of his blood to buy a slave to do his bidding. His mentally challenged cousin had been disowned and he'd taken her in for favors. It wasn't until Bakugo had tried to start up his bullying routine again that it became obvious to all that something wasn't right with the green-haired boy. "Ah!" Tay let out a soft groan in response, one of the reasons her true nature hadn't remained hidden for very long. Raising a brow, Izuku was pretty sure that was the zombie girl's way of agreeing to something. He still doubted she actually understood him, though. "Madraya. Keep that abomination of yours quiet and on a short leash," the teacher shouted, fear evident. Since he'd begun bringing Tay with him, Izuku no longer had teachers walking to his seat or even a piece of chalk thrown his way. The zombie girl had proven to be harder to deal with than an overly aggressive Doberman. "Fucking Romero," Bakugo muttered loud enough for all to hear. On cue, the rest of the students began to mutter amongst themselves. Romero. That was his new nickname. It might have been better than Deku, but Izuku had ended up hating it even more. Not even a week after returning to school, Bakugo had confronted him, looking to put him in his place. Apparently he'd taken offense to the rumors of him hiring a girl as a bodyguard. The explosive blonde hadn't gotten farther than grabbing the collar of Izuku's shirt before Tay had darted forward, digging her nails into his face. Before the green-haired teen had been able to separate the two, Bakugo had blown off half the undead girl's face in retaliation. The results weren't pretty. It had been the first time the blonde had used his quirk against another person without checking his power. When the smoke had cleared, raw and charred muscle, a glassed eye, and free-flowing blood had caused the surrounding witnesses to grow faint. But it was Tay unflinchingly charging at him again through it all that finally made Bakugo back away in horror. When Izuku had finally managed to get the zombie girl to calm down, the class had been aghast to see her skin and eye regenerating back to perfect condition. Saying they'd all been horrified would have been an extreme understatement. He'd heard that the school had even had to hire a temporary counselor for some of them. "Professor, we're going outside," Izuku said, not bothering to ask. Since he'd already gained the attention of the teacher, who usually did his best to ignore the two if at all possible, he'd decided to make use of it. You know what?" the teacher said, cutting himself off. "Just go." Izuku was once again thankful for the coward not wanting to expose the other students to his abomination any more than necessary. "I'll be feeding Tay-chan if anyone needs me," Izuku replied with a neutral tone, sending shivers through everyone in the classroom. Needless to say, he was out in less than 5 minutes. In the relatively short amount of time he'd spent with the zombie girl, Izuku had learned quite a bit. One important discovery was that Tay's organs were largely non-functional at this point. Feeding her wasn't really necessary. She no longer had any real need for food, the bathroom, or even air. Even so, she still asked for food occasionally. He chalked it up to an ingrained instinct to seek out nourishment. His mother had at first attempted to serve their new family member her own homemade food, but it quickly became obvious to them that the undead girl preferred something more unconventional. "God fucking damn it!" Izuku yelled, slamming a fist into the wall of the staircase at the rooftop of the school. He was so fed up with how the school had been treating him, and Tay, that he didn't even feel the breaking of 3 of his fingers or the tearing of the skin of his knuckles. He'd proven time and again that she was perfectly harmless unless he was physically endangered, but no. They were still all but demanding that he put an honest-to-God muzzle on the zombie girl. Mah. Speaking of. Tay quickly grabbed his newly broken hand and started licking the wounds. The zombie girl continued slurping at the bloodied limb until it had completely regenerated, only a minute passing. Why? Why do you still act so kind and caring toward me? Izuku asked his undead companion in distress, the sight of Tay licking his injury reminding him that he'd been lying to everyone. Aren't I the reason you died? Aren't I the reason you're still getting hurt? Aren't I the one who's refusing to let you go? 4 weeks into their new lives, Izuku had noticed with mixed feelings that Tay had started to act stranger than normal. Her movements slowed considerably, appearing to take great effort, and instead of just sticking close to him she'd taken every opportunity to lick him. Using the wonder of search engines, it hadn't taken him long to discover the zombie girl was exhibiting early signs of rigor mortis. His quirk had finally begun to lose its grip on the poor girl. Initially, he'd been relieved, believing it had been a good thing. It was going to be Tay's opportunity to finally rest as she'd always deserved. Then, he'd begun to panic. Perhaps it was purely unlucky the timing that his quirk had reached the end of its natural lifespan, but only the previous day Izuku had come to a realization. Undead as she was, Tay was abnormally strong for a quirkless, held no fear or hesitation in the face of pain or death, and was relatively inexhaustible. She was everything he needed to be a hero. He'd create the strategies and Tay would do the heavy lifting. It had been no different than any of the other heroes with pet-controlling quirks. Seeing Tay dying for a second time had stopped him cold. He was going to lose his chance to be a hero. Keeping the zombie girl moving had instantly become an all-consuming focus. Turning his overproductive mind to the task, Izuku had quickly decided to try giving up more of his blood. He'd banked on the hypothesis that the attempts at licking him were a compromise between the undead girl's desire for nourishment and her inability to harm him. With all of his resolve to become a hero potently mixed with the sheer terror of being caught, he'd snuck in a unused syringe from the first aid kit his mother kept in the bathroom. Luckily it had never been used, only bought at all before the discovery his quirk made worrying over injuries or sicknesses slightly moot. Izuku had determinedly fought through the nerve-wracking and painful ordeal of plunging the needle into his own flesh and siphoning the needed blood. Injecting it into Tay had turned out to be as simple as finding the biggest vein in her arm and stabbing once. Miraculously, in less than half an hour Tay had regained much of her mobility, a healthier appearance, and in Izuku's opinion, a happier disposition. Tay-chan, I wish you could tell me what to do, Izuku said to his companion. It would be so much easier if I knew I had to let you go, or could keep you with me. Fishing out a piece of beef jerky from his extra bento, he placed it in the zombie girl's awaiting mouth. Happily, Tay began to chew on the dried meat. Watching her munch away, the green-haired teen counted at least one blessing as a stray wind began to kick up. At least that odor's gone, he remarked, smiling lightly. I sure hope you at least feel cleaner now. Having lived with her for so long, it had only been recently that the Midoriya matriarch and son had realized that the undead addition to their family no longer exuded a putrid aroma. In one of his notebooks, Izuku had ended up hypothesizing that his blood must have finally eradicated the STDs that had plagued Tay in life. Regardless, his mother had made sure to remind him no crimes could be committed with the zombie girl's body. They'd continued to use the same mix of incense and rose essence though. No one had yet to complain about the pleasant smell, except for Bakugo, who stated that it made him sick, and no one knew if Tay's body could or would begin to decay as long as his blood was present. It was better to be safe than sorry. Needless to say, Izuku had come to love the perfume. After school, basking in the solitude they'd been able to enjoy for months now once Bakugo began to actively avoid them, Izuku and Tay walked home in companionable silence. Deciding to put times like this to good use, the green-haired teen had been trying to teach Tay how to walk more humanly, and overall look less haunting. In his opinion, he'd had some degree of success. "Tae-chan, we're going to have to train a lot more with entrance exams so close," Izuku said to the zombie girl, who lolled her head to the side in response. "So, etiquette or power?" Tae groaned, lolling her head back to its normal position. "You're right," Izuku agreed, feeling he knew approximately what the noise had meant. "We've really got to polish your behavior under duress. It'd suck if we were disqualified due to a sudden urge to bite." It wasn't that he didn't feel the need to work on building power, it was just that at this point he'd hit something of a plateau. Throughout the months that had passed, Izuku had taken up trainings of all sorts. In the mornings he'd take early jogs, lifted some weights, and had even thrown the occasional punch against a tree. After a homemade lunch from his mother, he'd gotten right back to it until the sun went down or he'd been called home for the night. From all of that work, he'd discovered that gaining any noticeable muscle would be incredibly difficult for him. And Tae, the zombie girl, had been an easy enough guess, due to the nature of being undead, but his own lack of growth had seemed unreasonable. That was, until he'd gone to save a cat. After school one random afternoon, Izuku had found a kitten trapped below a tree trunk that must have fallen during the previous night's storm. With no one else around to help, he had expected to work up quite the sweat to rescue the little critter. To his shock, he and Tae had easily moved the massive trunk. After calming down, Izuku had gone straight into his muttering analytics mode. Shortly after, he'd come to the conclusion that Tae's undead body no longer had subconscious limiters tied to her physical capabilities. She could unleash all of her strength regardless of resulting self-damage. For himself, after a bit of embarrassing self-examination and fumbling, he'd found that instead of increasing the size of his muscles, he was actually developing more muscle fibers. Luckily for him, the fact he'd never be as buff as All Might hadn't even registered in the face of the benefits of being able to grow stronger without adding bulky mass. It was no super strength, not by quirk standards, but it was better than quirkless strength. "We've also got to do something about this hunger," Izuku groused, rubbing his stomach. "Man, I wonder if we can get something like a burger to go on the way home." "Tae-chan?" Izuku stopped, turning in the middle of the tunnel they'd been walking through to shoot a questioning glance at his partner. Tae ignored him, rigidly hunched and growling in the other direction. "Tae-chan?" Izuku asked, "What's wrong?" The green-haired teen wasn't expecting his answer to come in the form of a manhole cover blowing up right in front of them. In the blink of an eye, a large blob of sewage had oozed up and into the tunnel. Then a pair of eyes and jagged teeth floated up to the front of the blob, grinning nastily. A villain. A medium-sized invisibility cloak. The villain exclaimed as he loomed over the pair, and his sister to boot. Before either Izuku or Tae could react, the globular villain had captured them both in tentacles of sludge. "Don't worry, little man," the villain cooed, smile growing beyond human limits. "It'll only hurt for 45 seconds when I take your body. Then you'll feel good. Promise." A gelatinous eye swung from Izuku to a struggling Tae, who was hopelessly clawing at the tentacle wrapped around Izuku. The eye flowed from its original spot, down the tentacle holding the zombie girl, before trailing over every inch covered by the slimy appendage. Especially when I use you to rape this cute big sis of yours." With those parting words, the villain forced open Izuku's mouth and shoved a tentacle into the orifice. The moment the invading limb entered his mouth, Izuku felt his trachea and esophagus collapse. He was glad for the automatic response. It would stop the villain from reaching his goal, but he was now in even more danger of asphyxiation. Fighting through the pain in his throat, the green-haired teen focused on finding an opening to give Tae an order. Her superior strength was his only hope. Just a small chance. Gotta tell her. Aim for the eye. Izuku's thoughts became muddier as he struggled, the lack of air affecting him faster than he'd anticipated. Through his blurring vision, the besieged teen noticed that Tae was crouched, as if ready to jump. It wasn't a groan nor a growl that tripped from Tae's lips as the zombie girl leapt through the air and clenched one of the sludge villain's eyes in her hand. It was a berserker's trumpet. Completely unbidden, the Rathed had managed to capture one of their foe's weakest points. Sure enough, writhing in pain, the villain dropped Izuku. "We need to," Izuku started to shout, cutting himself off to spit out the horrible taste in his mouth. Run. Instead of running away, the zombie girl darted and dodged around the sludge villain's wild attacks as she ran to him. In seconds, the undead Rathed had returned to Izuku's side. I'll kill you." The voice of the sludge villain modulated uncontrollably as his rage caused his body to lose cohesion. "You will not touch them," boomed a powerful and manly voice from behind the villain. "Why?" "Because I am here." The iconic words caused Izuku to freeze, his heart skipping a beat. It couldn't be. But the sight of a mountain of muscle bursting from the same hole the sludge villain had wiped away all doubt. It was his idol, All Might. In casual clothes? Texas Smash! All Might shouted, punching a fist in the direction of the villain. The insane amount of air pressure this caused forced a literal wall of wind to disperse the sludge villain, splattering him all along the walls. Pushed back as well, Izuku and Te tumbled to the ground. In less than a minute, All Might zoomed through the scene, encapsulating the villain in a pair of plastic bottles. Taking a moment turned, he examined the two kids his own ineptitudes had almost caused harm. Judging from their sizes and dress, he guessed he'd just saved a middle schooler and his older sister. They had to have had some familial connection surely. Both hadn't stopped checking over the other for injury since he'd arrived after all. He sort of worried for the girl though, she still appeared to be in a daze. "Are you two all right?" All Might asked, approaching the youngsters. "I'm terribly sorry for not arriving sooner. It must have been a truly awful experience. He'd have to make it up to them somehow. An autograph never hurt, right?" All Might hoped it'd be that simple. He really had to leave as soon as possible. "I'll be fine," Izuku waved off, seeming to forget whom he was speaking to while checking Te for damage. "I'm a regenerator after all." Then the green-haired teen's brain caught up with current events. All Might? In his shock, Izuku accidentally let go of Te, who sunk down to the ground bonelessly, and dropped his backpack, spilling its contents all over the place. Sorry. Izuku quickly fell into a panic. He'd managed to not only drop poor Te, who was obviously feeling the effects of low blood supply, but also spill his backpack everywhere and embarrass himself in front of the #1 hero. Distracted as he was by helping Te up, Izuku completely missed All Might snatching up a random notebook and signing the first pair of blank pages he could find. "Here you go, citizen," All Might said, handing back the notebook while thinking of how to lie himself out of a no doubt long-winded fan freak-out. "I hate to leave so soon, but I really must be getting this villain to the proper authorities." "Wait." For a single moment, All Might paused. "I need to ask you something," Izuku managed to start without stuttering. "You see, I'm aiming for you and no time," the ever-smiling pro declared, beginning to leave. "I hope to see you both as heroes in the future." With a single leaping step, the symbol of peace was gone. Izuku stood there, soggy from the excrement of the sludge villain and bruised all to hell, and felt more pain in his heart in that instant than he'd ever thought possible. He'd been dismissed. Just like that. His idol didn't even see him as worth a single conversation. I guess he was in a hurry. The words fell flat even to his own ears. Izuku knew the police station was in the opposite direction. Trying not to wallow in his self-pity, the green-haired teen finally set about gathering his things. "I mean, he even signed my notebook upside down." Putting away the new memorabilia, Izuku shouldered his backpack without further thought. Te, blank as ever, stepped up to his side. He didn't even notice you being. Izuku looked at the empty expression across his partner's face, her slight swaying as she stood waiting for him to do or say something. What do you think, Te-chan? Maybe for once his companion would offer him some advice? Or miraculously she could give a plausible explanation for why he was practically abandoned by his favorite hero? Really, he just needed to get rid of his dark thoughts. His bottled-up emotional stress was no excuse to hate others. Heh. Tei's short groan put a small smile on Izuku's face. Not at all satisfied but accepting it was all he was going to get, the green-haired teen began the walk home. Yeah? Well, you stink too, Izuku replied in a lighter tone. Come on. We've both gotta get a bath. Moans, groans, and grunts. While that was all he'd ever gotten from Tei, Izuku was pretty sure by this point he'd developed a pretty on-point feeling for the zombie girl's intentions. In any case, he made an effort just so he'd have some semblance of conversation. It kept away the loneliness somewhat. And definitely the bullies. And I've got to think of what to tell Mom. A week later, the junkyard of Dagobah Municipal Beach Park. God fucking damn it. The roar of frustration was accompanied by the crash of a punch being slammed into a dryer. The clenched fist dented the metal skin of the machine, earning broken bones and bleeding wounds. Gritting his teeth through the pain, Izuku managed to lift the already mending hand to his partner's face. Slowly, Tei began to lick away any blood that had yet to fall. Over the months the actions had become a sort of ritual for the green-haired boy and his zombie companion. Izuku's plan had been to finish middle school as a ghost. He'd keep quiet, garner no attention, and make it into UA with no past to haunt him. Although he'd made peace with the fact that Bakugo would also apply to UA and with his quirk be a shoo-in for acceptance, that hadn't meant they'd end up in the same class. Of course, like the piece of scum he'd long since proven himself to be, the homeroom teacher had ruined his efforts in moments by reading aloud his accepted application for entry to the prestigious high school. Why? Why did he have to overreact like that? Izuku asked the junk around him. Why does he feel the need to push everyone else down, me down? Izuku's loud supplication ended in another broken fist lodged in the side of the dryer, this time followed by a larger indentation in the metal skin than before. Patiently, the detached Tei lifted the newly wrecked limb and raised it to her lips. Gently, her discolored tongue darted out and licked away damage as it was found. The zombie girl's treatment continued until the hand was completely healed. In another life, another timeline, Izuku might have been a fearful kid, one prone to accepting the abuse dealt by those around him. But as the regenerator, as a Romero, he'd long since been driven past the point of feeling fear. Or so he thought. He hadn't flinched when Bakugo, incensed by their teachers announcing his approved application, had savagely snapped at him. The blonde had spat out insults, declarations of being number one with no challengers, and stated how the green-haired teen had no choice but to give up and disappear. In the face of such treatment, Izuku had passed on watching and disappeared from his ex-childhood friend's warpath. None of it had fazed him after all, nothing the blonde loudmouth could do to him, no amount of pain or degree of injury, could even slow him down for long. And death? That would only put a permanent stop to the exploding boy's dream, while Izuku would likely wake up a few minutes later completely fine. Bakugo's response? The angry teen had pushed Tei out of one of the classroom's windows. From the third floor. That should have been me, not you, Tei-chan, Izuku said, hugging the zombie girl. Laying her head on the green-haired teen's shoulder, Tei merely gave a soft moan. I still can't believe he only got a warning. In the face of the blonde once again getting off with a slap on the wrist, Izuku's reaction to the aggression had been explosive. None present had expected him to clock the bully in the face, leading to a broken and bleeding nose, before rushing out of the room to help the zombie girl. An hour later, the two had stood before the principal in moody silence. The sweaty, balding man had petitioned both teens to keep quiet about the altercation. No provable harm had come to Izuku and Tei, whose broken neck had already healed, while Bakugo risked seeing his future as a hero destroyed by a report of such murderous behavior. Apocalyptic in his seething rage, Izuku had threatened the coward in charge of his school with a lawsuit, dues for years of physical and psychological abuse just to start. In response, The principal had offered to expel Rikugo at the next sign of trouble. The bomber had nearly erupted at that, not seeing any reprehension in his actions. Needless to say, no one had left the office satisfied. Maybe I should use my quirk on him. Izuku pondered to himself, allowing a certain dark thought to surface. Maybe it'd fix that heart and brain of his? What do you think? That would be villainous. The unexpected male voice took the green-haired teen by surprise, causing him to yelp, while the Rathed beside him growled in warning. Having thought he was alone, Izuku wasn't prepared for the sight of his furtive observer when he turned around. Skeletal. That was the only way to describe the man before him. With eyes so sunken in their sockets they couldn't be easily seen and a lanky frame more skin and bone than muscle or fat, the visitor looked worse than half dead. The sad expression on the skeleton's face contrasted sharply with his vibrant, golden hair. "I wasn't planning on committing a crime," Izuku shouted, grabbing Tei's wrist as a precaution. She hadn't lashed out at an innocent person yet, but it was his responsibility to make sure it never happened in the first place. "I wasn't gonna hurt anyone." "Well, using your quirk without a license, to beat someone up to boot, is a crime," quipped a young man, probably a year or two older than Izuku, as he came up to join the sickly adult. The newcomer sported a rounded face, blue button-like eyes, neatly combed back gold hair, and a wide smile. "Even if the person deserves it. Young Tagata. You worded that wrong," the sickly older man mildly reprimanded. The boy, Tagata, hardly seemed too worried about it. Izuku looked between the two intruders who'd probably been spying on him for who knew how long, suddenly feeling self-conscious about letting out his inner grievances. This was all he needed right now, two complete strangers thinking he was planning on committing a crime. They'd no doubt call the police if he didn't try to clear the air. "I think there's been some degree of confusion here," Izuku nervously started, inching away from the two blondes. With little effort, he managed to pull Tei along with him. I don't have a combative quirk." "I find that hard to believe, young man," the skeletal man retorted, raising a sharp brow. "Besides, we aren't here to arrest you or anything." While glad to hear he wasn't facing imminent police action, Izuku was saddened to hear that once again an adult didn't believe him. Was there anyone, besides Tei, he could talk to in this world? "Why don't you believe me?" Izuku asked with a heavy sigh. A pair of fingers pointing behind him caused the green-haired teen to whip his head around. Oh. He supposed the sight of the man-handled dryer he'd been thrashing could be misleading. "That's why," Izuku muttered. He guessed he'd been so focused on punching as hard as he could so he could actually feel something that he'd completely ignored the state of his target. Going by how the dryer was completely trashed now, he'd have to further explore this facet of himself before he hurt someone. "So, what's your quirk?" Tagata asked in clear, honest curiosity. To himself, the blond young man entertained the idea of sparring with the green-haired boy. If it worked, it'd delay the insane workout his new coach had planned for him. For a little while. "I'm just a regenerator," Izuku eventually said through his reluctance, earning further disbelieving stares from the pair. It wasn't exactly a lie. The Quirk Registry Association had accepted the change of his quirk's name to Blood Repair, as that better reflected its abilities. But with the high possibility of more capabilities being discovered in the future, Izuku had decided to keep referring to himself as a simple regenerator. It might have been an oversimplification, but it was easier than the alternative. "But that would mean that you've been enduring the pain each of those impacts implies," the sickly man said, apparently concerned about Izuku's well-being. The green-haired teen had to admit, that would be a first. "That must be quite the regenerative ability," Tagata added, taking a thinking pose. "You've obviously been beating on this scrap for a while now. Breaking my hands or legs while training is nothing compared to some of the things I've had to endure," Izuku confessed, scratching the back of his head. His audience of two gaped in shock at his easy admittance, which was missed as the green-haired teen had turned his gaze to his feet. He'd never considered his quirk strong, not after failing to save the living Tay back then. As for being strong, I hope so. I need to be strong to get accepted to UA this year. Shock morphed into appraisal, the blondes now examining the green-haired teen before them in a new light. Ah. What's her deal? Tagata finally changed topics, bringing attention to the tall girl, with a vacant expression that hadn't said a word yet. "Oh, Tay-chan?" Izuku asked. "She's not much of a talker. She's a fast healer too though." HHMMMH. Izuku tried his best to hide a grin at Tay's grunt, earning confused glances and raised eyebrows in return. "Fine. And she packs a mean bite," Izuku added, acting as if the Ravnet had actually spoken instead of merely forced out a noise. Tagata opened his mouth, ostensibly to ask for clarification, when the sickly man coughed harshly. The distraction seemed enough to wipe the question from the younger man's mind as a new concern directed at the older man colored his expression. Shaking his head, the skeletal man waved the distress away. "That makes sense," the thin man said, wiping something from his mouth. "It's not unheard of for siblings to share close similarities in their quirks, especially mutant types like regenerators." Nodding his head, Izuku gladly passed off the man's assumptions for truth. If he could avoid explaining Tay's true nature and risk further ostracization, then he would. That being said, the man continued, "We actually came to train up young Tagata here. Would you care to join?" Surprised by the offer, Izuku instantly fell into deep consideration. "Are you sure, coach?" Tagata asked, smile blooming strong once more. "Of course." The sickly man answered quickly. Too quickly apparently, as for some reason he seemed to force himself to calm down. "I mean, yeah. A little friendly competition might push your limits, you know?" In the end, it didn't matter, as Izuku had reached his own decision. "Thank you for the offer, but I must decline," the green-haired teen said, sure in his words. "I dream of being a commander, someone who guides others to victory and makes their jobs easier. I don't want to get in your way, and if All Might doesn't think I'm even worth his time, I know I'll just drag you two down as I am right now." Once again the blondes were speechless, each for their own reasons. Tagata was amazed by the kid before him. Such determination and will were hallmarks for great hero potential. He couldn't wait to see the green teen at UA. The skeletal man, in contrast, was feeling his non-existent stomach sink into the ground. This was the kid he'd run into while catching the sludge villain, the one who'd been holding his own with his sister. He'd made an abrupt exit, sure, but did he really leave the impression that All Might had thought he wasn't worth his time? Had he really screwed up so damn much? "Thanks for the offer anyway," Izuku shouted as he began to leave the junk heap, pulling Tay behind him. "I hope to see you again at UA." In silence, the two blondes watched as the two disappeared down the street. One was fired up, the other slipping into self-recrimination and guilt. "What do you think, Yagi-sensei?" Tagata asked with a hammy smile, hopeful that they'd just found a stroke of luck. Could he be another candidate? Unfortunately, the shaking head of vibrant golden hair wasn't the answer the smiling teen had hoped for. "He has the right heart, sure. But..." Yagi trailed off, choking on the truth he was realizing he might have had a hand in worsening. "There's resentment in him too. We can't take the chance with him as he is at this moment." Nodding at his own words, sick as they made him, the skeletal man shifted to a heroic pose. "Now, I'm giving you 4 months to clear this entire beach. Let's get to it." They'd lost enough time. It was time to see what his old sidekick's candidate could do. He was anxious to see if the kid was worthy of inheriting his quirk, and the responsibility that came with it. 4 months later, UA, the large cement and glass behemoth that was illumined brightly in the light of day as Izuku and Tay walked up its steps. It was a day of days. The entrance exam was finally here. Scores of other hopefuls poured in from all sides, squeezing through the relatively small pair of double doors that stood as the final barrier to the prestigious academy's lobby. Izuku did his best to accept his nervousness and move past it. He couldn't afford to be a ghost anymore. His mother had once said, Years ago, that being a hero required honesty, heart, and forwardness. He wouldn't let her down now. The green-haired teen swore to himself then and there, as he cleared the last steps up to the long common area that led to his front doors, that he'd shine. He'd shine. Even if all others saw it in a sinister light. Well, we're finally here, Izuku muttered, getting a low grunt from his partner. It was an incredibly intimidating experience, being so close to one's dream. Out of the way, fucking Romero. In the span of seconds, Bakugo was there, as if there wasn't an entire open entryway he could have used instead. As the blonde passed, he roughly checked Izuku's shoulder, causing the green-haired boy to lose his balance and fall forward face first. Goo-ah! The scream came in a stereo of panic and distress. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut, hating that he'd be causing a scene before the first day. Unseen by him, Tay tried to lurch sideways in an attempt to catch him. Then, the falling abruptly stopped. "Are you all right?" Slowly, Izuku cracked open his eyes. Staring back at him was a cute brunette with rosy cheeks and innocent features, a gentle hand grasping his arm. He was floating? Yes, Izuku replied, piecing together what had happened. "Thanks to you, I think." As he floated, and holy shit he was weightless, Tay was quick to pull at Izuku until he was in an upright position. "Sorry I didn't ask first," the brunette coyly murmured. "But I just thought falling on the first day would be bad luck, you know?" Even with his feet now on the ground thanks to Tai, Izuku realized he still wasn't able to keep his weight under him. The girl's quirk was incredibly strong. Why was that boy so rude to you, Romero-san? The question, asked in ignorance and naivety, nonetheless caused a lance of pain to shoot through Izuku, easily showing on his face. I know it's not your fault. But Izuku struggled with how to phrase what he needed to say. How did one explain a lifetime of bullying to a stranger? "I'd be most grateful if you never say that name again. My name is Izuku Midoriya, and before you ask, Romero is that guy's way of insulting me." The green-haired teen hated the way the brunette flinched back, realizing she'd unintentionally offended the stranger she'd been trying to help out. He pushed on, hoping he could offer some small comfort. "Don't feel bad about it," Izuku reassured, "he's been doing it for a long time. I just hope he has ways to deal with people like him." It dawned on Izuku, as he finally relaxed from the adrenaline shot his impromptu fall and save had given him, that he was actually talking to a girl. Well, a girl that wasn't undead. Strangely, he couldn't seem to muster up the same icy fingers of panic he normally felt in such a situation. "Still, I'm sorry, I didn't know," the girl insisted, a wavering smile equal parts apologetic and friendly on her face. Wordlessly, the brunette pressed her fingertips together, and Izuku felt the laws of gravity pass judgment on him once more. "But why Romero? Sounds like a nice foreign name to me." Izuku grit his teeth, really not wanting to explain. Still, hadn't he just been thinking about being more honest with others? Heroes didn't lie, no matter how they felt about the situation. Besides, the only friends worth making at would be those who could accept him regardless of his quirk anyway. Awkwardly, the green-haired teen pointed to the seemingly distracted Rathed at his side. My quirk," Izuku stuttered, makes. Zombies. It was always in the eyes. Initially there were looks of confusion, people never seemed to be able to compute the idea of real-life zombies. Then there was recognition, Tay's pallor, vacant expression, and red eyes were undeniable pieces of evidence for most. Then, panic often followed shortly after, skipping acceptance entirely. Panic. Just like that now filling the chocolate orbs of the now pale-faced brunette. You know what?" The girl stammered, obviously leaning away from the reanimated corpse. "You just remembered I have to take an exam." "Yes. Right now actually." Bye. Izuku had to admit, the brunette didn't run away screaming. She did power walk away faster than the green-haired teen had ever seen someone attempt before though. That went well. Izuku deadpanned, turning to his zombified companion. Think we'll ever be accepted without prejudice here? Te groaned. You're right, Izuku agreed to the largely incoherent statement. There's no time to wax poetics, we've a test to ace. Let's go. Once more resolute in his purpose, Izuku and the zombie girl resumed their march toward the first obstacle to the green-haired teen's dream. Magnus, I don't dislike Okako, not in the slightest. In fact, I think all the ladies from Class 1A are lovely. But for this story, she won't be the main love interest. Chapter 3 A Sinister Starting Line. Magnus, here goes the start of Academy days, and how Izuku has changed. Don't worry. There will be romance, but it'll take time. In the meantime, enjoy. And remember, read and review. Disclaimer, I'm really surprised by the amount of support this story is getting. I honestly thought I'd be quickly flamed for turning such a cinnamon roll into a necromancer. Guess I was wrong. The short trek to the specified auditorium from U.A.'s front lawn had been an interesting experience for the boy with the cursed blood. Not a single inch of space throughout the hallways hadn't been covered in pictures of heroes, statues of the same posed in every alcove, and awards and trophies packed into each display case. Honestly, it would have felt like visiting a museum had it not been for the staff, pro heroes no less, who'd been directing him and other hopefuls towards their destination. Izuku had initially been excited to see that the pro hero presiding over the exam would be none other than Present Mick. After the flamboyant hero had braved an unresponsive audience, the green-haired teen was even more motivated to take the exam. Unfortunately, that enthusiasm had quickly died due to an unforeseen problem. Only a handful of minutes later, Izuku Midoriya had never considered himself to be a genius. In fact, he barely considered himself to be above average in the smarts department. He would admit, however, to being a nerd. One who liked studying, overthinking things, and acquiring knowledge on any topics that grabbed his interests. He rightfully attributed his often easily won perfect test scores to such characteristics. But as he sat there in his chair, Tay sitting next to him acting as a buffer against Bakugo's heated glare, Izuku looked at the test packet he'd been handed, and began to wonder. Just where did the average person's intelligence lie? This is it. 100 questions, 25 mathematical inquiries, and 1 essay. Izuku thought in disbelief as he flipped through the pages. Had the rest of his exam fallen out by accident? Uncertain of how to proceed, the green-haired boy hesitantly raised his hand. Yes, examinee 2234? Present Mick acknowledged with a resonant voice that easily filled the cavernous room of hopefuls. Do you need to feed that thing? It looked like the proctors for the exam had been forewarned about the undead that would be roaming the halls. And besides a raised brow, Izuku was glad to see the pro hero had no other reaction to Tay's presence. No sir, I just wanted to make sure that the exam I received was complete, Izuku said, holding up the packet in question. Mine only has 100 general knowledge and law questions, 25 low-difficulty mathematics problems, and an essay. It seems kind of short, and I'm worried that it's wrong somehow or a part fell out. The green-haired teen did not expect for the auditorium to explode with cries of despair at his words. Apparently the length of the exam, and the prospect of writing an essay, didn't sit well with some. That's all of it, yes, Present Mick confirmed before smirking devilishly. Already finished? This was the pros' classic comeback for questions like this. There was one every year, a prospect that would be that guy, or girl, who believed themselves too smart for the written test. It never ruffled his feathers though, he'd always get to enjoy watching the smarty pants get destroyed during the practical. A taste of a real-world beatdown was so much more educational than a reprimand after all. Yes sir, I finished it, Izuku replied, face expressing how often he'd faced this sort of situation before. Shut up. No one wants to hear your shit. Bakugo violently shouted. Thankfully Tei's presence was enough to dissuade the blonde from a more physical response. Fucking Romero. Surprisingly enough to Izuku, the murmurings of agreement he'd come to expect following the bomber's words never came. Instead, the glares and stink eyes of disapproval usually sent his way were directed at his ex-childhood friend. Okay, President Mick raised his voice, causing the more audio-inclined examinees to cringe. Put the packet face down and wait till time's up. Izuku did as directed as the pro went back to whatever it was he'd been doing to pass the time. Now faced with more free time than he'd expected to have, the green-haired teen decided to go over what he knew about the practical and analyze his battle tactics for any possible last-minute improvements. According to the little information provided, the second half of the exam consisted of a combat round. Examinees were to defeat robots with set point values, ranging from 1 to 3, within a relatively short amount of time. Ignoring the 0-point obstacle, Izuku noticed a few glaring holes in the practicals setup, the apparent absence of a score or penalty for property damage, as well as no expectation of a search and rescue of civilians, to name a few. It was almost as if UA was focusing more on pure destructive power rather than capacity to help, weeding out those unsuited for direct combat, or workless, before they even had a chance to prove themselves. It seemed like an incredible oversight on the administration's part. 2 hours later, Battle Center B. Izuku and Tei found themselves mingling outside the entrance to the testing site, overshadowed by an enormous wall of cement and steel that almost boggled the mind. The green-haired teen was currently drowning in tunnel vision. Student hopefuls from the same school had been separated, preventing easy cooperation, and they were about to face a massive simulated villain attack with complete strangers. While it seemed slightly unreasonable to Izuku, not having to worry about Bakugo and his attitude was a plus. I just don't get it. Why not simulate civilians too? Izuku's muttering continued, circling back to one of the two largest problems with the practical that he'd noticed. There's a lot of quirks that can only shine in search and rescue. Not all pro heroes are fighting machines. Too focused on his thoughts, the green-haired teen almost tripped over an inconspicuous cylindrical object. Luckily, Tei's arm shot out instantly, wrapping around him and keeping him upright. Oh, thanks Tei-chan, Izuku said, coming back to earth with a shot of adrenaline. Hey, this isn't trash. Sure enough, the small object turned out to be a bottle of pills. The orange and green coloring implied medication, leading Izuku to read the bottle's label in case it was crucial for another examinee. Mimiclizine hydrochloride. These are nausea pills, Izuku realized. Probably for motion sickness. Well, that doesn't sound too important for taking a test. Let's hand it over later. Pocketing the medication, the green-haired teen fully intended on trying to relax a little while he had time. Tei's sudden groan stopped him, catching his attention. What do you mean, it could be vital? Izuku asked the zombie girl. The blank stare from his undead partner made him huff in acceptance. Okay, you're right. If it could be, then we can't just leave it. Let's go ask if we can borrow a megaphone or something. Making haste, the two wove through the crowd in search of a staff member. As much as he hated being the center of attention, Izuku knew Tei had been right. He would prefer a brief embarrassment caused by over-worrying to the remorse of not helping someone in need. Unfortunately, with it getting closer to the time for the practical to begin, the crush of examinees made getting back to the edge of the crowd extremely difficult. In the past, middle school especially, Tei's presence had been enough to cause others to give Izuku a wide berth, but it seemed like hopefuls were made of sterner stuff. The green-haired teen made a mental note to celebrate the possibility of making friends later. Finding that the crowd lessened in density the closer he got to the giant gated entrance for the testing site, Izuku made his way in the direction, fearing he'd run out of time before the test began. The green-haired hero hopeful was beyond relieved when he finally sighted a suit-clad staff member. In a turn of uncharacteristically good coincidence, the pretty brunette who'd saved him from falling earlier was standing just off to the side of the adult. Hopefully after completing his good deed he'd have a chance to make a proper introduction. "Where do you think you are going?" a firm voice asked as Izuku felt a large hand grasp his shoulder. Turning around, the green-haired teen came face to face with the examinee who'd asked present Mick questions about the exam they were about to take. The teen was quite imposing, as tall as Tay with sharp, focused eyes made doubly so by the angular glasses he wore. The stern frown didn't help either. I just need to give something." Between his tongue being tied due to his lack of a social life and having to grab Tay's hand to keep her from lashing out, Izuku's explanation lost too much steam to be decipherable. "You're the one who attempted to demoralize the other examinees by revealing the length of the written exam, and that you'd already finished it, aren't you?" The imposing boy's severe expression grew suspicious, earning a growl from Tay. "Were you going to try and distract that girl next?" Izuku was beyond confused now. While he might have been used to facing accusations in the past, usually being spooky due to having a zombie trailing behind him all the time, this was the first time he'd ever been charged with attempted sabotage. The automatic responses he'd developed over the years died on the tip of his tongue. "Tomorrow? What are you talking about?" The green-haired teen was at a loss. "Now that I think on it, something about you doesn't add up," the bespectacled boy plowed on, ignoring Izuku's question. "Finishing the written exam so quickly would suggest you hold an intelligence-boosting quirk, yet you strut around with this girl as if she's under a pet-controlling quirk." Izuku didn't know whether to be flattered that a complete stranger equated his academic prowess to someone with superhuman intellect or overly nervous that said stranger had almost guessed an aspect of his quirk so easily. He really needed to put more effort into teaching Tay how to appear human apparently. "Aha!" Izuku's interrogator shouted, one arm chopping the air repeatedly. "You must be a higher-year student sent by the staff to cull applicants who are easily distracted or frightened by adversity." "As expected of you, the tall boy continued droning on, arm-chopping all the while. Izuku felt a headache coming on from the stranger's extreme case of tunnel vision. "Please tell me I'm not that bad when I go into muttering mode," Izuku asked Tay, who'd calmed down when the newcomer hadn't made any threatening movements towards him. The zombie girl gave a soft groan in response, which was almost missed under the murmur of the stranger. "God fucking damn it." Izuku finally snapped, "Could you please stop so I can go report this lost medication to the staff?" It wasn't quite a shout, but the green-haired teen's urgency and seriousness were clear. Snapping out of his monologuing, the strange, glasses-wearing boy stepped aside. For some unfathomable reason, he looked put out. Finally free, Izuku went to resume his task. Start. With speed belied by its size, the massive gate for the testing site opened. A pregnant silence settled over the gathered examinees, many looking about unsure of what had just happened. Izuku himself had a sinking feeling. Already in motion, he began to inch away from his targeted staff member and instead turned toward the now open gateway. What are you waiting for? There's no countdowns in real life. That was the only warning President Mick gave before the veritable horde of applicants charged forward. Not even a minute into it, and Izuku already felt the test had devolved into madness. Not a proper assessment of hero material at all. 5 minutes or halfway through the practical, Izuku had never been a fan of destruction. In fact, he loathed even the idea of causing property damage. When it had become clear to him that he'd never be like All Might, he'd begun studying other, less extreme, heroes with the same fervor he'd once reserved for the number one. His analytical mind had quickly zeroed in on key differences in how missions, operations, and even safety protocols were carried out between the two. Almost to a T, the more combat-oriented, powerful heroes had the harsher time of it in the aftermaths of major battles or operations. There were always a number of complaints about property damage that would follow in their wake, as in the case of Endeavor, or even environmental concerns, as was the case whenever Crust was involved. In contrast, while pros with less destructive, more specialized quirks might suffer more during the course of their missions, they were rarely taken to task afterwards. Doors and windows were easier to replace than railways and skyscrapers after all. Call it selfish, call it considerate, but Izuku had decided the less problems his heroing caused the better. This decision was why he changed his mindset concerning how to approach missions. Brains over brawn, it was a cliché to be sure, but one that suited him just fine. His mother still worried about him developing OCD however. Restrain! Izuku shouted, dodging a wide swipe from a one-pointer robot. The zombie girl slammed into the attacking machine, quickly attempting a grapple that pit her superior strength against its flailing limbs. Undead muscles strained against advanced hydraulics, not enough to pile on damage, but that was the point. The green-haired teen didn't want to rip the one-pointer's head off. Haha. That's 20. Izuku cheered as he punched the off switch located on the back of the foe villain. It had actually surprised the green-haired teen at the start. Upon engaging the robots, he'd been able to analyze their design and quickly realized that a multitude of different quirk types could easily exploit a number of obvious flaws. While destructive quirks could just destroy the robots with their lightly armored bodies, quirks leaning toward agility, speed, or stealth could take advantage of the conveniently placed off switch on their backs. For a more eclectic option, a technopathic or polarity quirk would have easily allowed a user access to the robot's rubber bullet turrets or low-yield rocket launchers. "How are you holding up, Tae-chan?" Izuku asked as he took a moment to take a quick rest. In the short time since the practical had begun, he'd taken a fair few hits, lucky robots that managed to break free from Tae's hold, and a few hopefuls that had been less than mindful of their quirk cues, causing debris to fly at him. Nothing so far had been close to lethal even for a normal human, but his regeneration was beginning to cause hunger pangs. Ow! The zombie girl's groan sounded pained, which only ever happened when her blood supply ran low. Izuku realized he had two options. Refuel Tae and stop hunting robots, or push on and hope that his partner could power through her debilitating rigor mortis. The dilemma reminded Izuku of something his mother had once told him when he'd first openly accepted he'd never be a super powerful hero like All Might. He'd told her that working with Tae had given him insight on how commanding others could still allow him to help save people and guide others to greater successes. In response, Senko had likened him to a surgeon, his future subordinates and/or co-workers his tools. He loved the analogy, and had quickly told Tae that she was his first scalpel. And as he stood there in a simulated war zone, he realized, a good doctor never let his tools become dull. That bad, huh? A rhetorical question to be sure. Izuku detached the one-pointer's gun arm hastily, finding the trigger made for human hands a hilarious feature. Okay then. I've got this now, so let's just focus on staying out of trouble for a bit and get you back up to snuff. We've got to be mindful of our limits. While seamlessly working with Tae against the machines, in the midst of the chaos of the exam, Izuku recognized he'd had an epiphany. He still wanted to be a hero, to save everyone he could, but where once he dreamed of jumping into the fire to save lives, he now understood he really could guide others into avoiding said fire while still saving everyone. His dream was a real possibility. That had lessened his concern about the practical to an extent. Any number of points would help him move toward his goal. If he got into the hero course, or even the support course, great, but missing those high marks wasn't the end of the world. Aiming high was important, but failing the UA entrance exam only meant he'd have to look elsewhere. There would always be other schools after all. Hell, as battle-oriented as the practical turned out to be, maybe he'd take a look at Shiketsu anyway. Less than 5 minutes left, Izuku announced, giving Tae an honest smile. This was a wild ride, huh? I think we might actually have a small chance for the hero course, you know? And if not, 20's got to be enough for support. Loosening his hold on the appropriated gun arm, Izuku almost dropped it when a sudden tremor hit the testing ground. Thrust back into high alert, the green-haired teen scanned the area for threats. Behind him, Tae let out a growl. Turning, Izuku saw the zombie girl was facing the center of the testing site. and the massive robot that now towered over the entire skyline with ease. With enormous arms and a cannon-like head with 8 glowing eye lenses, it was clear the final foe villain was a real heavy hitter. Thankfully, it didn't seem to have legs, only treads attached to the bottom of its torso, so its maximum speed wouldn't be too fast. Even so, all of the examinees in its vicinity immediately began to run away in fear. Sensing the motion below, the zero-pointer raised a massive fist and punched the street. Like a bomb going off, the colossal attack unleashed a devastating shockwave, sending a plume of dust through the streets and raining a cloud of debris down on fleeing hopefuls. Izuku looked at the giant robot with a critical stare. President Mick had said to avoid it, that it would only attack when near examinees. But that hadn't been the case. So what was its true purpose then? Or was it defective? It would require a tremendous effort by a group of coordinated combat quirk users to even put a dent in it, and there was no telling the amount of injuries that could occur if they tried taking it down. And should they succeed in the end? 0 points for the trouble. With these factors in mind, Izuku decided that sticking around wasn't the smart thing to do. So, set on leaving, the green-haired teen turned away from the titanic robot. It looked like this was the end of the line for him. Help. The voice was faint, but even amidst the chaos it carried. Mature dream or not, Izuku would never be able to ignore a cry for help. In an instant he stopped his retreat and gazed out in the direction of the call. To his horror, his eyes fell upon the cute brunette who'd helped him with her quirk earlier. She'd been trapped under a chunk of debris. Her face was screwed with pain and the wreckage pinning her from the waist down was surely the cause. The worst part. She didn't appear able to escape. Please. Help me. The plea, followed by a hand extending blindly outward in desperate supplication, spurred the green-haired teen into action. Only the most cold-hearted of bastards would have refused such a call, fear of being crushed to death under the thumb of a rampaging robot notwithstanding. Now, Izuku Midoriya was by no means an abnormally strong teen by hero society, nor exceptionally fast or agile. In fact, only hours ago, he wouldn't have labeled his own intelligence as anything special, though now he was beginning to suspect. But for all his shortcomings, there was one aspect of the green-haired teen that outshone all those around him. And as they watched from their darkened control room as he ran towards the trapped girl without hesitation, the observing future teachers of his newest hero hopefuls were given a front-row seat to this shining quality. Izuku Midoriya had the heart of a true hero. Rescue and retreat. Izuku shouted, calling out a basic strategy on the fly. I'll distract it. It was a risky plan, and he knew he'd never be able to defeat the zero-pointer on his own, but if he could save the girl, that was all that mattered. Look at me, you glorified trash can. Perhaps not the most imaginative of taunts, but combined with shooting an entire clip of rubber bullets at the robot's eye lenses, it did the trick. Even though not a shot landed, the dual annoyances managed to grab the attention of the advancing machine. Meanwhile, the trapped brunette watched as the green-haired boy she'd fled from earlier ran headfirst into danger. Shame clutched at her heart. She'd been so rude before, and here he was putting his life on the line to save her. Suddenly, the weight that had been a crushing presence on her lower body disappeared. Looking down, the girl noticed the zombie girl was straining to lift the masonry that had pinned her down. Not wasting a moment, she crawled free. Before the brunette could fully stand, her ankle burned something fierce, and flee on her own she felt herself lifted and slung across a slim pair of shoulders like a sack of potatoes. Craning her neck, the girl found that it was again a zombie girl, this time carrying her away from the danger. Moving too jarringly to speak, the girl instead chanced to watch the green-haired teen dip and dodge attacks like a badass character out of a video game. Yes. Taichan did it. Izuku murmured through clenched teeth, taking a second to look at the retreating girls. Now I can get away. Unfortunately, the green-haired teen had just made a classic rookie mistake. As soon as he took his eyes off the zero-pointer, the robot managed to land a bone-shattering punch on him. The sheer force of the blow sent Izuku shooting away, a green blur in the air. God fucking damn it. Izuku's scream followed him as he sailed through the air like a rocket. The pain was astronomical, but the worst part was he could already feel his shattered bones and pulverized muscles stitching themselves back together. Landing was going to be a bitch. He could already tell his body would break all over again at this rate. Just as he soared over Tei's head, Izuku felt the brunette, who'd been laid over the zombie girl's shoulder, reach out and catch his cheek with the whole of her hand. There was the clear sound of a snap, and the pilfered one-pointer gun dropped to the ground with a clatter. Izuku's body slowed to a halt mid-flight, hanging in the air like a puppet with its strings cut. "Re-release," the brunette said, steepling her fingers so the pads touched. Suddenly, with no warning, the zombie girl sat her on the ground, just as Izuku dropped to the street like a rock. The green-haired teen didn't move a muscle. Fearing for his health, the girl rushed over to see what the problem was. And immediately wished she hadn't. Izuku's neck had been twisted around completely 180 degrees. The brunette could hardly hold down her already roiling stomach at the sight, until a horrible realization hit her like a freight train. She'd just accidentally killed her savior by trying to slow his fall. The potent mix of nausea and horror was too much. Collapsing, the girl began to vomit everything left in her abused stomach. Crack. Whipping her head up at the abrupt noise, the brunette tried to pinpoint the source of the progressively louder sounds of cracking and popping to their source. It almost sounded like bones being forcibly snapped back into position. That hurts. A lot. The voice of her apparently not dead savior sent the girl reeling in frightened shock. Looking down, she witnessed the exact moment Izuku raised his hands and wrenched his head back into place. In moments, the ugly bruising that had been spreading around his neck faded too. Big, sweet, clear green eyes that couldn't belong to such an undying monster turned to look up at her. "Are you all right?" Izuku asked the brunette as soon as he'd gotten his wits back. "Does anything hurt?" Officially beyond anything she'd been prepared to handle, the girl gave the only answer she could. She rolled her eyes to the back of her head and fell, unconscious. She'd deal with reality when it made sense again. Izuku looked to Tai for an answer to what just happened. Helpfully, the zombie girl stared back, as blank as ever. The green-haired teen shrugged. Well, at least she didn't fall in her own vomit. Knowing he and his companion were at their limit, Izuku moved to prepare to haul the brunette onto his back. "Let's get her out of here, before the giant trash can, and that's time." Saved by President Mick's announcement, every examinee still conscious let out an explosive sigh of relief. That was convenient. Izuku sighed along, glad he only had to position the girl away from her vomit now. In no time at all, an extremely short, elderly woman appeared at the testing site. Decked out in a hospital-themed motif, it was immediately clear to Izuku that recovery girl, a heroine long famous for her healing quirk, had arrived. While the green-haired teen gushed and debated on whether or not to beg the legendary pro for an autograph, the youthful heroine went about and checked the student hopefuls for injuries. Unnoticed in the background, an imposing boy wearing glasses couldn't help the feelings of failure that were striking at his heart. He couldn't ignore the truth of what he'd just witnessed. When the situation had called for a hero, only one small boy had stood up and faced the challenge. None of the others had seen it, being too focused on escaping like he'd almost been, but the green-haired stranger he'd confronted earlier had braved a danger completely out of their league without question. As soon as he'd seen the trapped girl, he'd moved. Due to his gathered points, the boy knew he'd most likely be accepted into UA, but now he hoped the other boy did as well. He was someone worthy of calling a classmate. 1 week later, the days after the entrance exam, while waiting for U.A. answer, passed for Izuku much like his previous months of training had. He enjoyed his mother's large home-cooked meals, taught new tricks, and otherwise made himself useful. While his mother hadn't said it, he knew she'd been worried at first, hoping he wouldn't be disappointed. Letting her know he was only waiting to hear back which class would accept him, not if he had been accepted, allowed her to relax somewhat. Now Inko loved her son, that was plain to see, but it pained her to know that for all of his quirk's abilities her baby wasn't immune to the pain he faced. Her son's extraordinary endurance and ability to survive meant little to her when she knew he suffered through each ordeal he went through twice, once from the wounds when they were inflicted and once from the healing process that fixed them. Like any good mother, she wanted her son to reach his dream, but she feared it just the same. Heroes always ended up hurt in the end. That's why, in the darkest corner of her heart, Inko secretly prayed that Izuku would only get into the support course. Or even better, general studies. Izuku. Male. Inko called out as soon as she picked up the day's post and saw a letter that revealed a held seal. So today was the day her son had been waiting for. No matter what happened next, she swore she'd support him no matter what. Finally, Izuku shouted, sliding into the living room from the hallway. Now let's see which class it's gonna be. Inko smiled as she watched her son enter his focus stance, eyes glued to his letter. He neatly opened the little piece of cardstock, obviously wanting to keep it intact as a memento, and pulled out what was inside. In the palm of his hand sat a small metal disc, no bigger than a cup lid. Without warning, a hologram burst to life from the disc, causing Izuku to drop it on the table in shock. I am here. As a projection. The booming voice of All Might filled the entire apartment, the top pro's imposing image not diminished in the least by his questionably fashionable yellow suit. Surprised into speechlessness, mother and son collapsed onto the family couch to listen to the symbol of peace's message. Having taken her time, Tae slowly made her way from Izuku's room and stood behind the two. Actually, I came here to work at UA, All Might continued, slightly more controlled. Now then, Izuku Midoriya. While you scored a miraculous perfect score on the written exam, 20 points in the practical just isn't enough to warrant a place in the hero course. Instead of feeling much disappointment, Izuku took the news with a shrug, earning a discreet sigh of relief from his mother. Leaning in, the green-haired teen locked his gaze on the hologram. He still needed to know if he'd made it into the support course. At least if that was all there was to it. All Might's words caught the two living audience members by surprise once again, especially with how cheeky the hero sounded. Tae, unseen behind them, cocked her head to the side. Your actions spoke louder than any words ever could. Look here. All Might spun around, pointing a remote to a floating screen in the hologram. In the display, footage of Izuku's bravery ran from multiple angles. You, who had no combat ability, showed more courage than 1,000 lions. Inko couldn't feel her hands. Before her eyes, her baby was taking the role of an ant against an elephant, all to save a stranger in need. Was the room spinning? How could any hero course reject, no, not beg for you to accept? All Might shouted, open fist clenching in a dramatic pose. Heroes are meant to risk their lives to save others whenever the need arises, not for money or glory, but because it's the right thing to do. Caught in his own emotional appeal, All Might slammed his hands down and leaned into the camera, his electric blue eyes glowing under the shadow of his heavy brows. This is why examinees weren't informed about them. But in addition to villain points, the exam awarded rescue points. Rearing back, All Might waved to a scoring board, which was soon cut to fill the whole screen. Scanning the information quickly, Izuku found his slot. The line contained his name, villain points, and the newly flashing rescue points, 60. Yes indeed. You passed with flying colors. All Might announced, the camera cutting back to the larger-than-life hero. So come, young Midoriya, this is your hero academia. The dramatic welcome filled Izuku with elation, along with a small bit of guilt at judging the best academy in Eastern Japan ahead of time. Suddenly, the smiling image of All Might was disrupted by a holographic arm, which passed him a piece of paper. Quickly scanning the note's contents, the confused expression on the pro's face was clear to see. Izuku Midoriya and A? All Might asked, scratching the back of his head. Wait. This says she's a zombie? Didn't he call her his sister as Quickly as it had started, the hollow disc cut off. All Might's puzzled expression at last. Unintended blooper. Izuku picked up the unexpected means of acceptance, his own puzzlement clear. I don't remember ever telling All Might Tai was my sister. In fact, I've only said that to a handful of people. Expecting the look demanding explanation, Izuku slapped a palm onto his forehead. Don't judge me, Mom. You don't know how hard it is. Izuku's defensive rant died at the sight of his mother, unconsciously lying on the couch. The footage of his fight with the zero-pointer must have been too much for her all at once. I'm so grounded this weekend, Izuku said as he softly smiled at the woman who'd always supported him, knowing in advance that no amount of apologies were going to be enough to erase her newest traumas. At least she probably didn't see the part where the giant robot had clocked him with that mean punch. Or his interaction with the brunette afterwards. I guess I'll have to design us some hero costumes now, Izuku muttered, realizing his achievement came with some mandatory pre-semester requirements. What do you want, Tay? The zombie girl, who he'd eventually noticed, had been oddly attentive throughout the holographic acceptance letter. Leaning down, Tay effortlessly picked Enko up into a fireman's carry, executing an old half-order Izuku had once given her to always help his mother to bed if she ended up falling asleep early for some reason. Pausing, Tay turned to Izuku and groaned. Of course I'm not going to dress you up in a skin-tight suit, Izuku said, false offense heavy in his voice. Don't worry about it, I'll think of something good. It might have just been his idea of playful banter, but Izuku knew he needed to put real effort into these costumes. They had to be good, not only for his and Tay's safety, but to show how serious he was in becoming a hero. It wouldn't hurt if they also reassured his mother they weren't jumping headfirst into harm's way unprepared too. 1 month later, first day of class at UA. After a month away, Izuku and Tay were able to find their way through the halls of UA surprisingly easily. Like many other high schools that boasted multi-story buildings nowadays, the first floor was where all of the first year's classes would be, so it only took one flight of stairs to generally be in the right place. After that it was only a matter of walking the halls until they found where 1A, the duo's assigned class, was located. Luckily for them, they'd left early so getting a little lost along the way wouldn't be a problem. And the stairwell was only a handful of doors away from their destination. After getting over how over the top of the door to the room was, Izuku and Tay were ready for the first day of class. With each step, the green-haired teen dreaded how much of a disaster it would likely become. He well knew there was no point in bragging about points or deeds. The exam was only meant to indicate one's level of deservedness of having a place at the academy after all, not keeping it. And with his quirk, introductions were always a crapshoot. Izuku's first day of middle school came to mind. Just as he put his hand out to grab a door, Izuku saw the cute brunette from the exam out of the corner of his eye. She looked back at him and waved with a smile. You're the guy that saved me. The girl greeted with an energy and cheerfulness the green-haired teen hadn't been expecting. You were like a total badass and everything. Much too quickly for Izuku's comfort, the brunette had closed the distance between them. She didn't invade his personal space, but he still felt his mind start to fritz at their proximity. I can hardly say that. Izuku pushed out through his nervousness. I still couldn't dodge that last punch. Over the years, Izuku had practiced his speaking by talking to Tai, allowing him to greatly reduce his stuttering. However, that did little to nothing to get rid of his awkwardness around live people. Oh. Yeah. Sorry you got hurt saving me. The girl's cheerfulness died at the still fresh memory, the crushing guilt, the cracking of bones. If only I hadn't lost my medication. Wait. Is this yours? Izuku asked suddenly, slinging off his backpack. He dug around inside before pulling out the bottle of pills he'd found before the practical exam. The brunette's chocolate eyes blew wide open. Ah. What? Where did you find it? The girl was beside herself as she took the medicine, alternating between glancing at the label and the boy before her. "I kinda almost tripped over it right before the exam," Izuku explained, scratching his head with an awkward smile. "I meant to hand it over to a staff member but I got distracted." "You?" It was so quiet he almost missed it. Looking down, Izuku saw the brunette was slightly shaking. She was starting to tear up. "First you saved my life, and now you return my medication." The girl seemed on the edge of a breakdown the more she spoke. "And all I did. Even now." And just like that, Izuku understood. It hadn't taken him long to realize the brunette was most likely a naturally energetic and friendly person, the kind that jumped all over you to say hello and ask you if you were as happy as they were. But, like she tried to explain, she was keeping her distance from him instead of doing all that. He could see the guilt in her eyes, as well as the darting looks she sent. It doesn't matter. Blurting things out was one way to diffuse a situation, as Izuku supposed. Tay added a grunt for good measure. "What?" The girl started at the shout, her confusion and surprise enough to disrupt her emotional upheaval. Izuku shook his head, letting out a weak smile. "Zombies are unnerving, I know that, and Tay-chan's a zombie," Izuku explained. "You're just having a natural, instinctual reaction. I won't hold it against anyone for experiencing something as universal as the fear of the unknown and bizarre." Rubbing her eyes clear, the brunette swallowed down her troubled thoughts. She smiled back at Izuku, which the green-haired student took as a good sign. "As your classmate though, I hope I'll be able to prove to you that she's just a part of my quirk. I also hope you come to accept that she's just as reliable as I am," Izuku continued eloquently. "Why don't we start again?" The brunette nodded quickly, visibly relieved that she hadn't ruined a potential friendship. "Hello, my name is Izuku Madara and I'll be attending Class 1A. It's nice to meet you." To cap his speech, Izuku gave a courteous bow. He hoped it was obvious that he was more than willing to forgive and forget whatever insult the girl had imagined she'd given. Her beaming smile hinted that he might have been at least a little successful. "Hello to you. My name is Okako Uraraka." Okako began her own introduction, returning the polite bow. "I'll be attending Class 1A here. It's nice to meet you too." It was surprising how much better clearing the air made the girl feel. She didn't have to worry she was insulting her savior anymore. A sudden groan from Tay grabbed Okako's attention, although it was immediately stolen by Izuku's response to the zombie girl. "You're right, we should probably enter now and meet the rest of our classmates." As if understanding the undead was an everyday thing for him, Izuku once again reached out to open the door to the classroom. Meanwhile, Okako stood wide-eyed at the display. Did you just understand what she said?" Okako asked in alarm. "How did you do that?" Unfortunately, the answer to these questions would have to wait. As soon as he'd opened the door, Izuku, Tay, and Okako herself were caught up in the chaos that was Class 1A. The most eye-catching for the newcomers was the tall, bespectacled student with the overly imposing facial expression. From desk to desk the teen ran around the room, chopping his arms through the air as he preached his idea of order to anyone who'd listen. Which wasn't many. Izuku glanced around, noticing a shorter girl, for once giving him the height advantage with someone with frog-like features sitting 3 desks back from the door, silently eyeballing everyone as well. Somehow, she made holding a finger up to her mouth in consideration look cute. Leaning diagonally backwards from the desk in front of the froggy girl, excitedly making conversation with the floating girl's uniform, was a pink-skinned girl with wild hair like Izuku's and 2 curled horns. The green-haired teen got the impression that she'd either eaten a ton of sugar for breakfast or just had more energy than she knew what to do with. A boy with blood-red hair and shark-like teeth was switching between keeping an eye on the pink girl and yelling about manliness to a bored-looking girl with bizarre ears who could have been the poster child for punk rock. The Crimson Shark boy didn't seem to be offended that the girl was mostly ignoring him. Like a sixth sense, Izuku avoided looking at the far wall, where a familiar blonde was burning holes into anyone who'd make eye contact with him. "Hey you!" the imposing teen called out as he marched toward the door. Seeing as he was marching in his direction, Izuku pointed a finger at himself. He had no idea what this guy could want with him. "Yes, you. I owe you an apology." Izuku was too shocked to respond before the imposing teen had pushed on, arm still chopping. "During the exam I was rude to you, accusing you of being a fake student or someone unfit for the hero course. But, you were the only one who noticed the true intent of the exam. You not only more than earned your place here, but proved me wrong at every level." The imposing guy shifted to a more humble demeanor as he spoke, allowing Izuku to slightly relax himself. Able to concentrate now, the green-haired teen quickly recognized who the student before him was, the examinee that had accosted him and forced him to miss his chance to hand over Okako's medication. First of all, there wasn't some hidden facet to the exam to notice. "I just did what was right, at least in my heart," Izuku explained, shaking his head. Gesturing to the rosy-cheeked girl beside him, he smoothly transitioned attention away from himself. "And second, don't apologize to me. Apologize to her. The medication you stopped me from delivering to the staff. It was hers." The no longer imposing teen descended into a flurry of apologies to the now giggling Okako, all the while waving his arms in an overly dramatic fashion. The scene earned a warm smile from the boy with the cursed blood. For the first time he was meeting people who were nice to him without any ulterior motives. If he could meet even one more person like the two before him now, he'd be happy. "Go somewhere else if you want to play friends," a tired and gravely voice scolded, catching the teens off guard. Looking around, then down, the three found a man in a sleeping bag. Faster than someone wrapped up should be able to move, the man stood up and emerged from his toasty cocoon. Looking around the room with obvious disdain, he shuffled to the teacher's desk. Beaten down look notwithstanding, the man's very presence left quite the impression on the students. "I'm your homeroom teacher, Shouta Aizawa," the now named Aizawa announced, digging into his sleeping bag. Finding what he'd been looking for, he stood up, now holding a wad of UA gym uniforms. "This may seem sudden, but change into these and meet me at the athletics field. You have 10 minutes. His piece said. The gruff teacher left without another word, leaving confused students in his wake. 11 minutes later, 20 students and one zombie stood together at UA athletics field, the living of the group staring with no little surprise and fear at their teacher. He just announced that he was going to test their potential through physical tests, which they'd expected, while allowing them to use their quirks, which hadn't been but was enthusiastically welcomed. And then Mina Ashido had mentioned fun. If you think life here at UA is going to be all about fun, how about this? Aizawa had growled, glaring at the students. The one who scores lowest will face immediate expulsion. Oddly enough, there hadn't been any frightened pleas for fairness or something silly like that. It was apparent that all present had already accepted that UA Beyond Plus Ultra would throw extreme curveballs at them from day one. Now they were up to bat. The entrance exam was designed to identify those with the minimum required skills to enter this academy. Aizawa continued on, ignoring the now drawn faces of the teenagers lined up in front of him. Now it's up to me to ascertain if any of you have the potential to become real heroes. And we're going to start with this. From his pockets, Aizawa withdrew a simple-looking ball and his smartphone, which was open to an app with multiple challenges listed. Throwing a ball. If they'd been able to move a muscle, half of 1A would have collapsed in disbelief. Seeming to know what his potential students were thinking, the gruff teacher sighed at their ignorance. Your objective is for the ball to reach the furthest point possible. As long as you don't leave the circle here, you may use any means necessary, Aizawa explained. And yes, I'm serious about using your quirks. You're no longer bound by illogical middle school rules. Act like it. At this point, some of 1A had thawed from the chilling fear expulsion had shot into their veins. Looks of determination and grit began to enter the eyes of a number of the heroes in training. Belief in their abilities, belief in all of the hard work they'd put themselves through to get to this point, was lighting a fire in them. Now, the examinee who achieved the highest score in the practical exam will be our guinea pig, and go first, Aizawa announced. Bakugo, having largely been unaffected by the words spoken so far, smirked at this. Sure in his superiority, he began to step forward. Izuku Midoriya, you better set a good example of how to maximize the use of one's quirk. Bakugo stopped dead in his tracks as Aizawa motioned for Izuku to take the ball and step up to circle. The blonde glowered at the green-haired teen in absolute hatred. Of course, sir, Izuku replied, palming the ball and taking his place. Tae, whose green tracksuit contrasted heavily with the sea of blue surrounding her, followed closely. In middle school, Izuku knew he'd never surpassed 30 meters on a ball throw, never even close. But now he could use his quirk as he believed it had been intended. Standing firmly, he raised the ball up and, Tae-chan, please take this ball and place it at 1,000 meters exactly, gave an order. Dropping the ball into awaiting hands, the green-haired teen, and his bewildered teacher and fellow students, watched as the undead girl began to jog away. Soon enough, the group of onlookers watched as the zombie girl elegantly bent down and delicately placed the ball on the ground. In much less time than it had taken to carry out the order, Tae returned to her original position. Coming up to Izuku, it was clear she was waiting for another order. Exactly 1,000 meters, Aizawa stated, not bad. Showing his phone's display to the class, the gruff teacher revealed the level of precision used and how high the bar had been set. Cries of disbelief ran amok, more than once accompanied by calls of unfairness. They were summarily ignored. Bakugo reacted to it all the worst. The blonde was seeing red. As Izuku gave Tae her head pats, something he liked to think the zombie girl enjoyed, he couldn't help but feel blessed that for the first time, he found himself in a place that allowed him to be himself. He'd found nice people, a teacher that wasn't going to push him down, and was encouraged to use his quirk. He swore to himself then and there, he'd work harder than ever to convince everyone that his power had the potential to be used for the good of the people. But for the moment, he felt comfortable with his starting line.